The hall was cold and grand, with towering, crystalline walls that hummed with energy. Zalera stood at the center, her wrists bound by thin, iridescent chains that were more symbolic than functional. Her golden eyes flickered with anger and shame. She had been a princess once, a diplomat herself, and now, she was being handed over like a bargaining chip. A slave. The alien council sat above her on their throne, faces hidden behind ceremonial masks, pronouncing her punishment without emotion. The human will take her, one of them declared, their voice echoing in the vast chamber. As agreed. This will serve as a lesson to our people. She clenched her fists, every word slicing through her pride. The humans, who she had been taught to despise as crude and savage, had won a minor political victory, and she was the price. She would serve one of them, a disgrace she never imagined possible. James stood stiffly to the side, his military posture betraying his discomfort. He had seen enough conflict to know this situation was a trap, a game of politics that could spiral out of control at any moment. A war veteran with the scars to prove it, he was now a diplomat, though he still felt more comfortable in a battle zone than in a council room. The aliens were testing him, pushing the boundaries of what they thought humanity could endure. He stepped forward reluctantly, his boots echoing on the floor. His eyes met Zalera's. They were full of defiance and pain, but he sensed something else beneath the surface, fear. "She is yours," the counselor said, gesturing to Zalera without even a hint of respect for her former status. "Her fate is in your hands." James didn't reply immediately. His jaw clenched, trying to remain calm. He despised slavery, hated the very idea of owning another sentient being. But this was more than just about them. This was about humanity's fragile relationship with this alien race. Refusing the gift would be seen as an insult, maybe even an act of defiance that could lead to another war. He couldn't afford that, no one could. "I accept," he said finally, his voice even but cold. Zalera's gaze narrowed. He could feel the weight of her hatred, but he didn't blame her. He wasn't her enemy, but to her, he was just another human conqueror. The chains around Zalera's wrists dissolved with a flick of the counselor's hand, and she stepped forward, head held high despite her predicament. She looked at James, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her movements were stiff, calculated, as if she were trying to maintain the last shred of dignity she could muster. James extended a hand, not to lead her but to offer her a chance to walk alongside him. She didn't take it. Instead, she marched ahead, shoulders rigid with pride, refusing to acknowledge him. He followed her out of the council chamber in silence, ignoring the stares of both human and alien onlookers. As they stepped into his ship, the tension was palpable. He tried to break it by speaking first. "You'll have your own quarters. You won't be treated like what they expect." His voice was steady, but inside he felt a storm brewing. He didn't know how to handle this. He wasn't trained for it. Wars? Yes. Diplomatic negotiations? Sure. But this? Zalera didn't look at him. She didn't even respond. Her silence was louder than any words she could have spoken. She sat down in the corner of the ship's main hold, far away from him, her back straight and eyes focused on the view outside the window as they took off. Hours passed in silence. James had hoped for some sort of exchange, anything to break the growing discomfort between them, but Zalera kept her distance. He could see her eyes darting, observing, but never meeting his. When they arrived at his quarters on the human base, she finally spoke, her voice as sharp as a blade. "What do you plan to do with me, human?" Her words dripped with disdain. "What cruel punishments do your kind inflict on those you enslave?" James met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I don't plan to do anything to you," he said firmly. "You're not a slave here, Zalera. You're my responsibility, but I won't treat you like a prisoner." Her laugh was bitter, mocking. "Responsibility? Is that what you call it? Do you think I'm naive enough to believe that your kind is different from mine?" "I don't care what you believe," James replied, his voice level but edged with frustration. I'm not here to hurt you. But I won't let you leave either. The council would see that as a betrayal, and they'd make sure neither of us survived that. Zalera stared at him, eyes burning with suspicion, but there was something else now, something more complicated: confusion. He wasn't what she had expected. Zalera had expected chains, confinement, maybe even violence. In her world, captors asserted dominance swiftly, cruelty marking the lines of control. She sat on the edge of her bed, hands clenched in her lap, trying to make sense of her situation. She had been given her own quarters, soft human fabrics, and food that wasn't just sustenance but comfort. It didn't align with what she'd been taught about humans. They were supposed to be savage, brutal. But James had barely spoken to her, let alone harmed her. This was worse somehow, this waiting for the cruelty to reveal itself. She glanced at the small tray of food left outside her door. He hadn't called her to eat, hadn't forced her to cook for him. He had simply left it there, as though she were, what? A guest? Her lip curled. What game was he playing? Was this some twisted psychological torment? She pushed the tray aside, refusing to touch it. If this was an act, she wouldn't fall for it. Her people would rather starve than be fooled by false kindness. Her mind reeled, consumed by the thoughts of her status. In her culture, to be owned, to be under someone's control, was to be nothing. Yet James treated her like she wasn't even there half the time. He barely looked at her, kept his distance, but not out of malice. It felt indifferent. As though he didn't want this any more than she did. That night, when she ventured into the common room, he sat silently at a table, reading through data on his holoscreen. He didn't acknowledge her, didn't demand she serve him, didn't impose any commands or expectations. She paced the room, her eyes occasionally darting towards him, waiting for the moment he'd reveal his true nature. Nothing. Not even a glance in her direction. It was infuriating. Finally, unable to stand the silence, she spoke. Why do you do this? He didn't look up from his screen. Do what? You treat me like I'm not even here, she hissed, pacing in front of him. You don't command me. You don't demand anything from me. What are you waiting for? He sighed, closing the hollow screen, and leaned back in his chair, regarding her with a calm she found maddening. I told you, you're not my prisoner. I'm not interested in making your life worse than it already is. That makes no sense. If I were in your position, would demand service, compliance. I would ensure you understood your place. Her voice was sharp, but there was a quiver beneath it. Fear. Uncertainty. Well, I'm not you, he replied, his tone steady but distant. I don't want a slave. She stared at him, her mind scrambling to understand. Then what do you want? Why take me at all? Because I didn't have a choice. His eyes hardened slightly, and for the first time, she saw a glimpse of the man underneath. You think I wanted this? To be a part of their punishment scheme? I'm doing what I have to, same as you. The simplicity of his answer disarmed her. He wasn't pretending. He really didn't want this. That was unfamiliar. In her world, everyone wanted power, dominance, to bend others to their will. This human was either a fool or far more dangerous than she thought. So, I'm just here, to do nothing? She asked, voice laden with suspicion. You're here to exist, Zalera. I don't need anything from you. The council does, but I don't. His words hung in the air, unsettling her even more. She expected him to play the role of captor, the cruel master who would take pleasure in her submission. Instead, he gave her freedom within the confines of the base, treated her with respect, or was it indifference? The more she thought about it, the less she understood his motives. No alien she knew would give power so freely to someone beneath them. But the frustration simmered in her. You pretend to be honorable, but I know humans. I know the wars you've waged, the planets you've colonized, the species you've destroyed. You talk about freedom, but you'll take it as soon as it benefits you. James's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something dangerous passing behind his eyes. You think I don't know what my people are capable of? I fought in those wars. I've seen what humans do when pushed. But I also know what it means to live with that weight. I'm not interested in being anyone's oppressor, least of all yours. His calm was unnerving. There was strength beneath the surface, a quiet intensity that spoke of violence held back by sheer willpower. She had expected rage, maybe even cruelty, but his restraint confused her more than anything else. I don't trust you, she said, her voice softer now, a hint of vulnerability creeping in despite herself. I don't expect you to, he replied. But I'm not going to hurt you. You'll have to figure that out on your own. Zalera narrowed her eyes, but there was no venom left in her voice. Why? He stood up, shrugging slightly as if the answer was too simple for words. Because it's the right thing to do. He walked past her, leaving the room as the tension settled, thick and unresolved. The cold barrier between them had slowly begun to soften, though neither would admit it openly. Days passed with less tension, their conversations, though brief, becoming less hostile. Zalera watched James more closely now, noting how different he was from the image she had constructed in her mind. He wasn't the monster she had been led to believe all humans were. He was disciplined, patient, and focused on his tasks, and despite her early suspicions, he had never once tried to dominate her. One evening, as he sorted through a collection of old Earth artifacts in his study, Zalera found herself curiously observing the human relics. A battered flag hung on the wall, the colors faded but still proud. She couldn't hold back her curiosity any longer. What does it mean? She asked, gesturing to the flag. James glanced up from his work, then back at the flag. That's a symbol from one of our oldest revolutions. It's about the fight for freedom, independence. It represents a time when humans overthrew those who tried to rule over them. We've had a lot of those moments in our history. She frowned. You fought to free yourselves from rulers, yet you accept owning others? His gaze didn't waver. We've made mistakes, terrible ones. But we also learned from them. That's the thing about humans, we don't stay the same. We fight for change, even when it's painful. And when we see something wrong, eventually, we fix it. Zalera's initial instinct was to dismiss his words as self-righteous propaganda, but something in his voice gave her pause. He believed in this, deeply. The idea of constant change and struggle for freedom was foreign to her. In her world, hierarchies were rigid, unchanging. Even as she held on to her resentment, a small part of her began to wonder if perhaps her people had it wrong. Later, as James prepared a meal, another gesture that confused her, he continued the conversation. You said before that if our positions were reversed, you'd demand service from me. Is that how your people live? She hesitated, unsure of what to reveal, but something had shifted between them. In my culture, status is everything. To serve is to lose honor. You humans, you seem to think honor comes from freedom. It does, he replied without hesitation. But it's not just about freedom for ourselves. It's about making sure everyone has it. Her brow furrowed. She had been raised to believe that superiority was innate, that some were simply born to lead while others followed. But now, she wasn't so sure. You sound like you're trying to convince yourself as much as you're convincing me. He chuckled softly. Maybe. I've seen a lot of things that make it hard to believe in sometimes. Their conversations became more frequent after that. Zalera, despite herself, began to take part in his routines. She started offering to help, small things at first. Cleaning up after meals, organizing the living space, even assisting with repairs around the base. It wasn't a sense of duty but more a desire to understand this strange man who defied all her expectations. With every act of assistance, she found herself less defined by her status as his slave and more as an equal participant in their day-to-day survival. One afternoon, an alien visitor arrived, masked and cloaked. Zalera noticed immediately something was off, the way the stranger moved, the subtle tension in their stance. James didn't catch it in time. As the stranger reached for something in their cloak, Zalera's instincts kicked in. She lunged forward, knocking James out of the way as a concealed weapon was drawn. She struck the alien assassin before they could attack, disarming them and sending them stumbling backward. James quickly neutralized the threat, but it was Zalera's quick reaction that had saved them both. When the dust settled, James looked at her, his eyes filled with something different than before. Gratitude, yes, but also a newfound respect. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. She straightened, her breath still coming in shallow bursts. "I couldn't let them kill you." The words hung between them, charged with a meaning neither was ready to fully unpack. But in that moment, the shift was undeniable. James no longer saw her as a burden or an obligation. She had saved his life, and that act of loyalty, born from something other than fear or compulsion, had changed everything. That evening, as they sat together in silence, James opened up in a way he never had before. "I didn't want this, you know," he said, staring at the floor. "The war, the violence. I've done things I'm not proud of. That's why I stepped back, became a diplomat. I'm tired of fighting. Tired of seeing people destroyed by power." Zalera listened, her anger toward him softened by the weight of his words. "Your people forced you to be part of their game, just like me," she said quietly. He nodded. "Yeah. But I won't let that define us. I won't let them make us into something we're not." For the first time since she had arrived, Zalera felt a strange sense of peace. James wasn't just a human captor, he was someone who had suffered as much as she had, in different ways. Maybe they weren't so different after all. The tension came without warning. One evening, as the stillness of the base settled in, an urgent transmission broke through the silence. Zalera's heart sank when she heard the encrypted alien code. Her people had found her. James quickly decoded the message. It wasn't a negotiation or a warning, it was a rescue mission. The transmission was clear: Zalera's family believed she was being held against her will, mistreated by humans, and they were coming to extract her by force. The timing couldn't have been worse. Relations between humanity and her race were already fragile. A covert mission like this could spark something neither side could contain. "They think you're a prisoner," James muttered, rubbing his temple as he paced the room. "They think I've hurt you." Zalera stood still, her mind racing. Her people had acted out of honor, out of a misguided sense of duty to her. But the thought of returning to them now felt wrong. She looked at James, sensing the weight of the decision he was about to make. He was torn, she could see it, the diplomat in him screaming for calm, for a way to resolve this without escalating things further. But there was something else in his eyes too, a deep, unspoken desire to protect her. "What are you going to do?" Zalera asked softly, though she already knew the answer would not come easily. James stopped pacing, facing her with a grim expression. "If I let them take you, it could mean war. They think I've enslaved you, and if I hand you over, it's an admission of guilt. But if I resist," he shook his head, "I don't know if we can hold them off without causing an intergalactic incident." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Zalera felt the pull of her old life, the familiar rhythms of duty and honor whispering at the edges of her mind. But then she looked at James, the man who had treated her with more respect than her own people had shown her in years. He had given her freedom in a way that no one from her world ever could. "I don't want to go back," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. James blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "I don't belong with them anymore," she continued, her tone firm. "I've seen what my people value. I've seen what you value. They'll just put me back in a cage, whether it's gilded or not, it's still a cage. Here, with you, I've had a choice. You realize what that means, right?" he asked, his voice low. "If you stay, I'm refusing their demands. That could set off a war." "I know," Zalera said, stepping closer, her golden eyes steady. "But my loyalty is here now, with you." For the first time since the message arrived, James seemed to relax, just a fraction. He looked at her with a mixture of relief and respect. Then we make a stand. As the moments ticked down to the arrival of the alien rescue squad, James prepared his response. He sent a message back, his voice steady and calm, but filled with the conviction that had earned him respect on battlefields and diplomatic tables alike. When the alien ships arrived, cloaked and ready for combat, they were met by a single transmission from James, standing resolutely in front of the camera, Zalera at his side. "She's not coming back with you," James said firmly. "Zalera is no prisoner here. She's made her choice." The alien commander's voice crackled in through the comms, seething with barely contained anger. "You have no right to keep her. This is an insult to our people, a violation of our agreement." James stood tall, his gaze unwavering. The agreement was never about keeping people in chains. It was about preventing another war. But if you think we're going to bow down to threats and violence, you don't know humanity at all. We don't bend to oppression, and we won't stand by while you try to reclaim her like property. We fought for our freedom, and will fight for hers. Zalera watched as the silence stretched on the other end of the transmission. Her heart pounded, waiting for the alien commander's response. The tension was suffocating. This was the moment where everything would either spiral into chaos or resolve. Finally, the alien commander spoke again, though his voice had lost its earlier venom. "If she stays, this will not end well for you, human." James didn't flinch. "Maybe not. But at least we'll have stood for something." Zalera felt a surge of pride in that moment, not just for James, but for herself. For the first time in her life, she had chosen her own path. In the days following the standoff, tensions were high, but no immediate retaliation came. James had made his stand, and now it was a waiting game. The alien faction, caught off guard by Zalera's choice, hesitated to escalate into open conflict. Negotiations followed, not in the usual sense, but through back channels, quiet and calculated. There were no public declarations, only the subtle maneuvering of diplomats from both sides. James, having risked everything, was summoned to meet with the Alien Council, this time, not as an enemy but as a key figure in preventing war. Zalera watched him prepare for the meeting with a calm resolve that surprised her. The weight of what they'd done, the future they had chosen, hung in the air between them. As James suited up, he glanced over at her. "They might try to take you back, for some kind of deal." "They won't succeed," Zalera replied, her tone firm. "I've made my decision." It was true. There was no turning back for her. What had begun as a sentence of humiliation had transformed into something she could never have imagined. She had found freedom, not in the sense her people had taught her, but in the form of choice. She had chosen to stay, to defy the expectations of her culture, and now, standing beside James, she would see it through. The negotiation wasn't easy. The alien faction, still clinging to their rigid ideas of honor and hierarchy, fought hard for Zalera's return. But in the end, it was her voice that silenced their arguments. In front of the council, with James standing at her side, she spoke with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "I am not your possession," she declared, her gaze sweeping across the room of alien dignitaries. "I have chosen my own path. I am not a slave, and I will not return to a life where my choices are dictated by others. If you value honor, then honor this, my right to live freely, as a sentient being." There was no arguing with that. The council, after days of deliberation, finally conceded. Zalera's decision would be respected. She was free to stay with James, not as a servant, but as an equal. The agreement wasn't just a personal victory, it was a signal that humanity's values of freedom and self-determination had started to resonate, even among those who had once seen them as weak. When the negotiations ended, James and Zalera returned home, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. The intensity of the past days had brought them closer than either had anticipated. In a quiet moment, as they sat together under the stars, the reality of their bond became undeniable. "I never imagined things would turn out this way," Zalera said softly, her gaze on the distant stars. James smiled, his hand brushing hers. "Neither did I. But I think, this was always where it was headed. She looked at him then, her expression open in a way it had never been before. James, I've been trying to understand what I feel. It's more than gratitude, more than respect. I love you. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, James seemed caught off guard, but then his face softened, his hand tightening around hers. I love you too. It wasn't just a declaration of affection, it was the culmination of everything they had been through. In each other, they had found not just companionship, but a union that transcended the boundaries of their cultures. They were no longer just human and alien, master and servant. They were partners, equals. Their marriage was a quiet affair, devoid of the pomp and ceremony that might have been expected in either of their cultures. But it didn't need any of that. In their vows, they promised not just to love and protect each other, but to continue the fight for the freedom and values they both now shared. It was a personal commitment, but it carried the weight of something much larger. Word of their union spread quickly, and with it, ripples of change began to move through the stars. Zalera's people, once so rigid in their beliefs, couldn't ignore the power of her choice. Some began to question the long-held traditions of slavery and hierarchy. If a royal like Zalera could embrace the ideals of freedom and equality, perhaps their own systems were flawed. Quietly, change began to stir. As for humanity, the story of James and Zalera became a symbol of the potential for peace and unity between vastly different species. It was a testament to the HFY principles, humanity's ability to adapt, to stand firm in its beliefs, and to inspire change through compassion and defiance. In the final moments of their journey, James and Zalera stood together, side by side, gazing out at the vast expanse of space. The stars stretched out before them, an endless frontier of challenges and possibilities. They were ready to face whatever came next, knowing that no matter what, they would do so together, as equals, as partners, bound by love and the shared belief that freedom was the ultimate prize worth fighting for.